Hello, everyone, and welcome to the VectoScalar Tech Talk show. I'm your host, Vikas Jain. As you know, VectoScalar Tech Talk is an online live show where we invite digital and technology transformation senior tech leaders to share their global journey and what they have done to achieve this thing. And in this episode, our guest speaker, Andrew Bryant, who is a global speaker, author, and executive coach, is going to cover the future-ready leadership for the tech companies. Welcome, Andrew, to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Vikas. It's a pleasure to be here virtually.
Thanks. Before we move further, in case you have any question for Andrew Bryant, you can type in the chat box below, and I'll be taking up those questions as we move on. Also, to give you a brief introduction about Andrew Bryant, so he's a global leadership playbook. Andrew Bryant speaks on being human and increasing ownership, responsibility, and accountability in a post-pandemic and digital world. Andrew believes that leadership is a conversation, and he uses the approach to coach executive leaders teams to function, collaborate, and scale. And he has written a book. So he was just sharing that book, the new leadership playbook was written for a software companies. That is a uniqueness that we see, that it was written for a software company. And personally, I met Andrew in Singapore in 2017. It was part of a global conference, and since then, when I'm following his work. So right now you are in Portugal, right?
Portugal, yes, on the western end of Europe.
Wow, interesting. So as a global speaker, I think he chooses to live in various parts of the world so that he gets the global perspective. Is that the case?
It is. The beauty of being able to travel and work is that I get to choose my home base. So I'm English by birth, Australian by passport. I lived in Asia for 17 years. Now I'm back in Europe for the last couple of years. And it does open up new doorways. When I was in Singapore, I was always speaking in India or Indonesia or Malaysia or Hong Kong. Now I'm here in Portugal over the next few weeks. I'm speaking in Romania, Norway, Iceland. So it opens different doors when you choose your home base.
Wow, that's great to hear about that. So let's begin the discussion. And the first question is around self-leadership. So as you are an expertise on self-leadership, so what is self-leadership first of all? And how is it different from when we say it's leadership?
Okay, so here's a maxim that I invite your watchers and listeners to consider. All right, you can't lead others unless you first lead yourself. Leadership is not a one-man thing. There is no leadership unless people follow you, right? Yep. Winston Churchill said this, here's a test of leadership. Look behind you, and if nobody's following, you're just taking a walk. So on LinkedIn and various other platforms, there are these very simple two-dimensional memes about leadership is like this. Well, not necessarily. Leadership depends on people following, and that depends on their motivation, their skill set, the environment which they're in, and your leadership style. Yep. So you need, as a leader, if you want to get people to follow you, you have to understand yourself and others. So leadership always starts with self-leadership. Now, in 2012, I published a book with Dr. Anna Kazan in which we define self-leadership as the practice of intentionally influencing your thinking, feeling, and actions towards your objectives. So it is a practice of intention. So we all think we have free will, but the psychologists and sociologists will tell us we have very little free will. I mean, we don't choose the country or the time of our birth. We don't choose our parents. We don't choose our primary school teachers or our university professors, all of the people who have massive influence on our framing and our outlook on the world. So it's only when we wake up and say, hang on a moment, what do I want? What is my objective? As opposed to playing out some pre-programming that your culture has delivered to you. Only when you take that moment do you step into the driver's seat of your life and begin to practice self-leadership. right? That you are intentional about what do I think about this? What do I feel about this? What are my choices and opportunities around the actions I'm going to take towards the things that I want to achieve? And so initially, self-leadership can sound selfish, but you can't lead others unless you first lead yourself. And the real test of leadership is always not your leadership, but how many followers and how many new leaders you create. And you only do that when you develop self-leaders.
Oh, that's interesting to know. And I think that's the kind of thought leadership you talked about, that you define self-leadership. And I read in your profile somewhere that there are 100 plus research articles which are pointing to your research on self-leadership. Is that the case?
Yes, I mean, in the 1990s, when I first started speaking about self-leadership, I thought I'd invented the term. Now, the idea, the concept, of course, goes back to the Greek philosophers, to Epictetus, or even to the Chinese philosophers, to Lao Tzu. And you could say that self-leadership is potentially based in logotherapy with Dr. Viktor Frankl and his book, Man's Search for Meaning. But when I started writing about self-leadership and defining it as such, I thought I had invented it in a modern context. Fortunately or unfortunately, but I wasn't first. In 1987, a guy called Charles Mantz had written a book on self-leadership, and he had defined it in there. But in 2012, with Dr. Anna Kazan, we did a research project on self-leadership across the world, and we got to define or redefine self-leadership as this practice of intentionally influencing your thinking, feeling, and action toward your objectives. And subsequently, self-leadership has become very topical, very important, particularly with the increase in autonomy through the pandemic. And so anybody who's been researching self-leadership tends to refer to Anna and my book of 2012. And I think we're up to about 150 PhD research articles that have referenced our book for the definition of self-leadership.
That's great. That's amazing. And now coming to your book on the new leadership playbook, and you just mentioned that before the session that it was written for the success of a software company to scale the software company, right? So what is the difference between the leadership style that is required in other industry versus the leadership style for the tech companies?
Well, it's same and different. So yeah, this was the beginning of the pandemic. I'd been working with a software company in Silicon Valley. I was coaching the CEO and all the members of the executive leadership team. And they really had raised up their ability to operate as a team. And it's my experience, having worked with executive leadership teams of many software companies around the world, that when I come in, they're not even a team, they're a work group. And the distinction between a work group and a team is, a work group, you have the central axis, the CEO, and then the CTO, the CIO, the CFO, the COO, the CPO, and whatever CXO you have. And they're all operating with the CEO as the decision maker, and they're desperately trying to get his or her attention and resources. When a team happens, you have an interdependence where the CMO is talking to the CTO or the CIO about and collaborating and creating new ideas. Now, I'd done that work with this software company, and now they were living their culture. Their mission as an executive leadership team was to walk the behaviors of the culture, not just talk about it, but live it. And the CPO, the Chief People Officer, said, "This is great. I want to cascade it through the company. We're growing rapidly. We're onboarding people, and they need to understand the culture, and they need to understand how to behave. Will you write us a book?" So we negotiated a bit, and I agreed to write them their playbook, but I hung on to the IP so that I could share that with the world. Now, back to your question. What's the difference between a software company and any other type of companies? Well, it is the agility. It is the need to make decisions rapidly, and then if those decisions don't work out, to make new decisions. So what's the same in every company is people should take ownership of their position within the organization. But in a software company, this is essential. This is life or death, because they have to own each iteration of the code, and if it's not working, they need to own the feedback and improve it. They need to own their communication with their stakeholders, with their clients, with other people. And they need to have a really high level of leaning in and going, okay, that's a problem. How can I contribute to solving it? Rather than the opposite of self-leadership, which is blaming, complaining, and the victim mindset.
That's interesting. So that's what the difference between a leader in a software company versus other company, and primary difference is agility, the agility that is required to get the work done and take the
I
decision.
think if I had to put my finger on one thing, yes, that's it. Because software can change so quickly. If I'm working with an oil and gas company or a 400-year-old Swiss bank, the infrastructure, the ability to change things takes so long. I remember when I first moved to Asia, I was consulting to an airline, and these are great ideas, but it's going to take us this long to get that into some kind of standard operating procedure. And I'm like, well, no, people need to be able to think on the spot now, right? We've all had that terrible customer service experience where you walk up to the customer service representative and they go, that's not my job. Or computer says no, right? They're taking no ownership to their part in the company and their ability to solve problems and deliver service for the organization. In a software company, everybody can feel part of the product or the service along the way. Everybody should take ownership because every line of code matters.
Okay, that's an interesting insight. And as you just talked about that, when you move to Asia, so you have a context of being a global speaker, and as a person who has lived in western part of the world and the eastern part of the world, do you see any leadership differences between the leaders from western part of the world versus eastern part of the world?
Oh, well, this could get me in a lot of trouble because it's difficult to talk about this without making mass generalizations and stereotypes. But let me dive in and see if I can give some perspectives. And I'll tell it as a personal story, right? So I moved to Asia in 2004. And as I packed my bags to leave Australia to move to Asia, a friend of mine said, Andrew, you're going to have to learn to be humble. And I'm like, how freaking arrogant do you think I am? He said, no, you're not arrogant, but you're confident. I said, yeah, I know what I know how to do. That doesn't mean I'm better than anybody else. And the definition of arrogance is to think you're better than other people. He said, yes. However, in Asia, confidence can be mistaken as arrogance. And I'm like, yeah, right. And I got to Asia and I saw that he had a fantastic insight that often we consider, arrogance is just countercultural in most Asian countries, right? People try desperately to get away from it because there's a high value for humility. So then when I got to Asia, I saw they were over-indexing on the humility, and that was making it unable to actually do the leadership that was required. So what do I mean by over-indexing on humility? The word humility comes from the Latin humus, which means dirt or ground. And so humility technically and psychologically means grounded. Somebody who is humble has an accurate, neither overestimated nor underestimated view of their own abilities. However, in Asia, humility got interpreted as making myself smaller so that I don't offend you, all right? And so people go, oh, I'm just a this. I'm just a software engineer. I'm just the vice president. Everything was preceded with I'm just, and everybody was elevating everybody else. Now, that's not helpful, right? You need somebody who's good at what they do. I've had a couple of medical crises in my life, and when I went to see a surgeon, I asked the surgeon who had to take out a large part of my insides, "Are you any good at this?" And he was quite surprised by the question. And he said, well, yeah, I mean, I spent a year in the US just studying this procedure and my results are 100%. I said, that's what I needed to know. Because if you said, oh, well, I'm just a surgeon, I'm just doing my best, I would have got a second opinion, right? Are you with me on this, right?
Yes.
So humility is being grounded. Yeah, this guy was good at what he did. He did a great surgery. I came out the other side. I'm here and happy and healthy to tell you that that story is behind me. But if the guy was not confident in his ability, I couldn't trust him. And at the beginning of this conversation, I shared with you that leadership only happens when there's followership. And followership only happens when we trust the leader. And if the leader is being overly humble, then that's a challenge to the leadership. And so what I found when I was in Asia was a lot of leaders needed to step up, not to be arrogant, but to be confident in their abilities and say, hey, we need to do this because this is my area of expertise. This is what needs to happen. That doesn't mean I'm not going to listen to input, but at some point I need to make a decision. Now, in the West, of course, they index the other way. I know everything. I know more than everybody else. That is equally dangerous. So I think we need to learn from the East and West, and as the Buddha would have said, walk the middle ground between overconfidence and underconfidence. Find that sweet spot and say, hey, this is what I know a lot about. This is what I'm still exploring and open to. And hey, I need to listen to you and find out what your expertise and contribution is. And I think a future-ready leader, to the point of our podcast here, is somebody who is open to those listening skills.
Okay, that's interesting, and I'm sure as you begin your answer with that, probably I'm going to be in the mess. So you, as a global speaker, you have handled that mess very well. That you have talked about the both sides and how a simple topic like being humble, how it's and humility, how it is the actual root of it, and how is it perceived differently in different part of the world. That's a great anecdote. Yeah. And you talked about your health crisis. And before the podcast started, you were telling that you are on a roller coaster ride with your weight, right? Oh, so what is that?
Well, this is me having to practice what I preach in terms of self-leadership, right? So self-leadership is the practice of intentionally influencing your thinking, feeling, and action toward your objectives. So my objective right now, I just lost 6 kilos and I've got another 18 to lose. I want to go back to the weight I was at 40. I had a six-pack at 40. And the reason I want to do that is that in 2021, I did have a health crisis. They thought I had cancer. This is a happy ending. It turned out to just be a lump inside me, but they had to take out a large part of my insides, discovered that this big lump was benign. Now, after that surgery, my wife and I moved to Portugal, and mentally I was just like, I've got a new lease of life, and, any day above ground is a good day, because during that challenging time, I thought I wasn't going to live. And so suddenly I'm in Portugal, there's great wine, there's great food. And over a 2-year period, I put on 15 kilos. And I went, okay, enough is enough. And I had a bit of a wake-up call from a medical checkup, and they said, you really should drop the weight. And I went, you know what, it's time. And so I'm practicing intentionally influencing my thinking about food, my feeling about food, and my action about food and exercise. And just in 6 weeks, I've dropped 6 kilos. So, we as leaders have to practice what we preach in all aspects of our life. I don't know who it was that said this, but what we do in small things, we do in big things.
Yeah.
And so if a leader doesn't have some level of self-awareness and self-regulation around their health or their emotional control, their activities, then we're not going to trust them in other areas. So whilst people can be technically brilliant, they can be a great chief financial officer, great chief technical officer, great CEO, but if they lose it, with the smallest trigger, or they've got one area of their life that they're just completely out of control with, it's going to put a question mark on our trust of them. And to be a great leader, you have to create followers, and followers need to trust you. And trust comes from consistency, doesn't it?
Okay, that's great. And as you talked about, I think I could recall one quote which said, "How you do anything is how you do everything." So that's
Yeah,
basically some that
yeah,
thought process. Yes. Now,
it
going
is.
forward, just talking about the vector scalar technologies. So, vector scalar technology is having 100 plus software engineers, right? So, companies which are of this much size, like 100 software engineers or 500 software engineer, especially in Asia, when they go out and get in touch with the western part of the world, the companies they want to develop, grow their business, talk to them. So you just talked about the leadership style and how the humility is taken differently in different part of the world. So probably when somebody is going out to generate business, is there any tip for the companies like which are especially in the Asian part of the world, like what they can do differently? Because you have a global exposure of working with different type of companies.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'm very proud of is in in 17 years in Asia, I did a lot of coaching for individual executives and executive leaders, um, both in China and in India. And in fact, I spent a lot of time in India with software companies, um, getting the executives to step up to that next level. Now, the interesting thing specifically about India is you have Indians, for want of a better, in-country Indians, and you have a huge diaspora of Indians in other parts of the world.
Yep.
And the interesting thing is, I speak to a lot of Indians who are in the United States, been there a few years, and have got to very senior levels. I mean, let's face it, the top of any software company, if it doesn't have an Indian national, we're deeply suspicious of it. Why is your CEO not Indian, right? I mean, look at Microsoft and Google, right? So, but there is a transition, and it's interesting. I've had, the CTO of a global software company talking to the executives that are still in India and berating them that they are not leaning into their expertise. That, because in the US, they're having to sell this product, but then if a customer talks directly into India, everybody's being very humble and very subservient. And he said, you're not building the trust. You have to think globally. Now, what is it that really delivers that trust is competence. And if your competence is not being backed up by confidence, then people are not going to buy. And we need to be confident that a software company is going to solve our problem, right? We all, we use software to solve problems, whether, it is my online accounting software that allows me to, have a company headquarters in Dubai and Singapore and live in Portugal. I need to know that's going to work, whether it's going to be a payment gateway like Stripe, that if somebody's going to pay me, do I trust that, right? A simple thing, I had a computer crash myself just recently, and I was researching a new piece of backup software. And I'm like, I need this backup software. Where do I get it from? What one is going to work for me? Because I've just had a crisis. I don't want to go through this again. It has to work. So when I ask a vendor, is this going to solve my problem? I want them to say, yes, it's going to solve your problem. And firstly, I want them to know that they've understood my problem, right? And then when they say yes, I'm going to ask the backup question, how do I know? And I need them to say, well, because we do this, and this to ensure our product is up to standard, and we will do this, and this to make sure that you're always happy. And when they say that, I go, okay, fine, here you go. Here's my problem. You now are, I'm paying a software as a service fee for you to solve my problem. So it really is simple. We buy value. We buy something that we feel is going to enhance our lives or reduce our pain. And we buy that from people that we trust. And we trust people because they confidently communicate their competence.
That's such a beautiful insight. I think for my third upcoming book, this is going to be, the topic is what is the difference between top professionals, and I think I could just visualize a circle with this word, that trust coming from competence, which is coming from confidence, and how you creatively communicate that confidence. And then again, probably it's a spiral that you keep on evolving from bottom towards the top. You build the trust, you build the competence, communicate with confidence, and then you further build the trust, right? That's interesting.
Well, it is covered in the new leadership playbook, so I got that one nailed. All right.
Wow, that's so interesting. And then shortly, I see some question in the pipeline, so I'll take up those questions. And in some time, I'll also give the link of this leadership book, so people who want to download the leadership book,
Yep.
they can download it. So we have this question coming from Simple Setia, that what is the ideal balance between technical proficiency and leadership skills for tech leaders?
Okay, well, thank you from Simple Setia. Look, it's an interesting question, but the question contains a frame by implication, right? For me to answer that question, I would have to agree that it is a balance. And I don't, a balance is kind of an either or. I think it is both, right? The interesting thing is that people go to university to develop, or technical college to develop their technical proficiency. They learn their coding skills, etc., or their project management skills. They learn and they learn and they learn. And then they get promoted. And then suddenly they go, oh, goodness gracious, now I need to be a manager, a supervisor, a leader. How do I add that on? Now, the point is that they both happen in parallel. So our education system is at fault here, perhaps. Organizations perhaps are at fault, waiting to give people leadership roles until they're at a senior level. We see leadership being developed at school, right? Some kids step up and take ownership and lead the pack, sometimes for bad, sometimes for good. And I've done a lot of work for at-risk and disadvantaged teenagers. And in fact, coding for kids, that don't have financial background is a great skill. You should be developing your leadership skills all the way through in parallel. It's not either or. A top senior leader must understand how the code is built, how is built. And in parallel, understand that they need to lead themselves. Self-leadership comes first, and how to build a team around them. Time and time again, I've been called in to help an executive who is failing because they're technically brilliant, but leadership incompetent. And I'm like, what? How is it you didn't realize you needed to start developing this skill 10 years ago? So I don't even think it's a balance. I think they both happen. Otherwise you're saying, what should I focus on more? My left arm or my right arm? You need both arms to be effective. So I would answer it is start developing your leadership skills right now. Volunteer for something, step up onto a project, make sure you know how to get individuals to come together and collectively do work towards an objective. Notice that's how I'm defining management and leadership, is getting people together to collectively, collaboratively deliver work towards an objective. So leadership is a social enterprise, right? We're just getting people together. And we've done that at our chess club or at our church group or we've done that. That's leadership. Stop putting it up here that you have to be Bill Gates to be, a leader. No, you start leadership right now. Okay, kind of a long answer to a simple question.
And that too coming from Simple Setia.
Well, I couldn't miss the pun, right?
Yes. Okay. Thanks, Simple. I hope your question is answered. In your book and in your work, you talk about, Andrew, that when we talk about leadership is a conversation. So can we give us some more examples that how leadership is a conversation?
Yes. So the book is called The New Leadership Playbook because, I wrote it for a North American company, and Americans have this, American football concept of a play, which is a series of set moves. And as I was talking to the chief people officer, she said, I need you to make it practical. I need to make it really easy, right, for people. And they need to be able to get it. And I go, okay, well, let's diagnose. What are some of the things that they're struggling with? And she said, well, one of the first things is that they can't give feedback. And I go, okay. So, let's create the feedback play. And for that company, we came up with 10 plays. In the book, we now have 12. But then it dawned on me that each of these plays was just a conversation. Leadership is a conversation, one-to-one, one-to-many. So let's use the feedback conversation as an example. I created a simple acronym for everybody to remember. Fact, impact, future. Right? So when we give somebody feedback, there is a fact. There is the shared reality of what happened. So let's say we're giving feedback to Simon, and we say, hey, Simon, in the project meeting yesterday after lunch, I was expecting you to contribute some ideas, and you stayed silent. Do you remember that? And Simon goes, yeah, project meeting yesterday after lunch, No, I didn't say anything, right? So if he said, oh, no, I talked all through the meeting, and you go, well, hang on, you and I were in different rooms, because the room I was in, you said nothing, right? So Simon has to accept the feedback in terms of what's the index. You can't say, hey, Simon, I'm not happy with your performance, because Simon's like, well, what performance? Well, specifically, Thursday after lunch, project meeting, you didn't speak up. Then you switch to impact. What is the impact of you not speaking up, Simon? Now, Simon might be blank, but he should be able to come up with the answer. And the answer is something like, if he doesn't contribute his ideas, those ideas don't get used in the project, and they could be really valuable. And if Simon doesn't contribute, Simon's brand within the team as a value creator is diminished. And that's going to diminish his promotion prospects. So Simon needs to get the impact of his behavior, because we don't change our behavior unless we experience some kind of negative impact. We talked about my roller coaster of putting on and losing weight. Well, I went to see the doctor, and it turns out that I stopped breathing 17 times a night, right? Because I wore the apparatus, and there was you have sleep apnea, you stop breathing, and it said we're going to give you a machine to sleep with. I said, I don't want one. They said, well, lose the weight. I got a choice, right? Do I want to wear a machine to sleep, or do I lose the weight? It's simple. I take ownership. I'll lose the weight, right? I got the facts. All right. I stopped breathing 17 times an hour. What's the impact? You have to use a machine. I don't want a machine. Therefore, I'm going to change. And that's the F, the future. Fact, impact, future. Here's the facts. What are the impacts? What are you going to do differently? So in Simon's case, Simon, you didn't speak up. The project is the poorer for you not contributing ideas. Your brand is diminished because you didn't contribute the ideas. What are you going to do differently in the future? And Simon goes, you know what? I think I'm going to speak up, but I really need you to, help just leverage me into the conversation the first couple of times. And you go, okay, I can do that. All right. I shouldn't have to do that, but I'll do that. All right. Are we in agreement? And there's your fact, impact, future conversation. It's done. It's dusted. A behavior should change.
That's interesting. I think you are just saying those few words, which seems like a framework: fact, impact, and future. So you observe the fact, you see the impact, and how you can create the future out of it. And I think our next question from the viewer is in line with what you just mentioned. So probably you can give more details on it. So Saddam Hussein is asking, how can tech leaders cultivate a culture of continuous learning, which is very imperative for especially the tech companies, and adaptability within their organization, given the fast-paced nature of the industry?
Leaders are learners. Self-learning is one of the three pillars of self-leadership. The first two are self-awareness and self-regulation. Anybody who is not seeing their ownership and responsibility to continually upgrade their education is going to be redundant. So we need to firstly lead by example. Talk about the new things that you've learned. What's the latest book you've been reading? What's the podcast you've been listening to? Obviously, you're on this podcast and you're listening to this. What are you doing to upgrade your learning? And most of the senior leaders that I work with are, talk about, at their monthly, once a month rather, at their leadership meeting, they're saying, hey, this is the book I read. Or sometimes they create book clubs and go, hey, here's a copy of this book, everybody, let's discuss it, in next month at our offsite or something like that. Now, when the CEO gives you a book and says, we're going to discuss it, you're going to read that book. You're not going to be like the kid that, left his book report on the bus, right? So you really need to be talking about learning, upskilling. And the previous question, right, what about the balance of leadership, is getting tech people to start reading people skills book, leadership books, the new leadership playbook, for instance. People should be reading that. So
Yes.
You really need to be leading by example, talking about what you're learning, and also talking about your mistakes as well, because learning is often about, well, I tried this, it didn't work. And Vikas, you asked me what's the difference in a software company versus perhaps manufacturing or engineering or hospitality or professional services. It's that agility, right? So, I tried to do this, I put 50 hours into this, and I discovered it didn't work, right? I mean, share that. I remember a CEO that I coached in Singapore, and I remember on his last day in the office, he was putting his stuff in a cardboard box to leave the office, and people were in the corridors crying because this leader was leaving, and I'd been his coach, and I remember he and I did a speech together to the organization, and he talked about a time that he was the CEO of the Hong Kong Yacht Club, and he bought this yacht for $1 million, thinking it would be an asset to the yacht club, and it ended up being a waste of money. And so he said to the organization, make mistakes, just don't make your mistakes more expensive than mine. So talk about your learning and talk about your mistakes, and that makes it okay for other people to try new things. Because if you're not getting people to lean in and try new things, you're not getting any kind of acceleration of learning and development. Make time available for learning, right? We tend to, everything's about, in professional service firms like lawyers and accountants, everything's about billable hours. Are you creating a culture in your organization where, you could say, hey, I'm scheduled out for 2 hours on Thursday afternoon to, attend this course. And that's okay. That you're not expecting code to be written for those 2 hours, that they're self-learning, they're going off to learn a new programming language or a new project management way of doing things. Make that part of the culture. So that's 3 or 4 powerful suggestions to apply.
Oh, that's. I think they were actually very powerful suggestion. As recently, I was listening to Jeff Bezos, Amazon's founder's podcast, where he was saying that in their meeting at Amazon, what they have decided to stop, like give people actually the papers, so they have to read the stuff for first 15 minutes or 20 minutes, and then only they will start the discussion. So he said that why not give the pre-read material beforehand, and he said that many executive may just out of their business will not read it and then come unprepared. So we have made it a practice that there is no presentation, you just read the stuff then and there in the meeting for first 20 minutes, and then discussion will start. That's an interesting insight, how self-learning culture is important, and that's your foundation for self-leadership. That was again an interesting. So I'm seeing one more question, and probably in the interest of time, this probably is going to be the last question for today's podcast. And viewers, I'm sure you are getting good value from Andrew's perspective about future ready leadership for tech companies. So do share your commendation, how you felt about this podcast in the comment box below, while I take up the last question. So this last question is coming from Aman Chada, who is asking, tech companies often operate in a fast-paced environment, and you specifically talked about agility. So how can tech leaders cultivate that agility in decision making and encourage a culture of experimentation? How to develop that?
Well, that is one of the conversations in the in the new leadership playbook. Decisiveness is is one of the conversations. How to be decisive, how to encourage decisiveness. Right? Now, if you are making all the decisions for your team, they will never make any decisions for themselves. So, anybody that's got children, particularly when they go through the teenage years, notice the shift in ownership, right? So in self-leadership, there's a distinction between responsibility for and accountable to. So as an adult, I'm responsible for myself. I'm responsible for my thinking, my feeling, my words, my actions. Vikas, you are responsible for yourself. You're an adult. Now, you and I are accountable to each other in this podcast. I'm accountable in that I agreed to turn up at this time, at this place, prepared. We have a contract, we have an agreement, right? Now, when it comes to kids, right, when our children are small, we are responsible for them because they are not old enough to be responsible for themselves. But by the time they become teenagers, they start wanting to take ownership, right? Yeah. And either we give them that ownership in a way with clear accountabilities, or we try and withhold it. Not under my roof. You won't do that until you get your own house, then you can. We have to start getting kids to make decisions early, and this is the second time I've talked about going back to teenage years. So if we are a manager, a leader, and we're dealing with adults, many of those adults were not allowed to make decisions as children, as teenagers, as young adults. They were told what to do. And now suddenly you're asking them to be decisive. And it's a shock to the system. They don't know how to do it. So you have to wean them into it gently, give them some decisions within a scope that's not going to wreck the company, right? So here's a project. You need to make the decisions on how to do that, right? And
That's a
you,
beautiful insight. Yeah.
it is, you kind of have to wean people in. Now you have to give them so in the book, there's a decision-making framework to help you say, okay, I'm going to invite you to make some decisions. Here's how you're going to go about making those decisions. And we'll talk about the decisions you've made later. But you're going to stand by those decisions. So it really, decisiveness is like a muscle, right? You don't go into the gym and load all the weights onto the barbell the first time and try and push it. You'll rip a muscle, right? So you have to build up decisiveness, just lift the bar. And then when you can lift the bar, you can add some weights. So develop your decisiveness over time. CEOs, CTOs, CFOs make multi-million, billion-dollar decisions. They didn't do that the first day on the job. They built that muscle over time.
Okay, that's an interesting insight. Just start small. So whatever you have, whatever capability you have, start with that and keep growing. And I see a lot of commendation coming in the comment box. So Simple is saying that thank you, Andrew, for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. Your tech talk has inspired and motivated us to strive for excellence in our leadership journey. We have another LinkedIn viewer sharing insightful session, and Akhilesh also mentioned Akhilesh Antwal, great session. So a lot of commendation in the comment box also, Andrew, for your session. So what is your last message for the future ready leaders? Any last words before we conclude today's podcast?
Yes. So be intentional. What is the best version of yourself? We are all hurtling into the future right now. So I jokingly call, I'm 62 years old, so I jokingly call myself version 6.2, right? Next year, I'll be version 6.3. And then, I already have goals and objectives for version 6.5. So I'm going to become a better version of myself, right? We may not have much free will, but we do have agency. We do have the ability to take choices or exercise choices towards opportunities. We need to visualize a better version of ourselves. What is the version of myself that is a better leader, that is learning more, that is confident? Seeing that in the future and becoming that individual. That is the big transformation that you're going to create change in yourself and those around you. So what is the best version of yourself? Get to work on that today.
Wow, finding best version of yourself. And as a software company, I think versioning is very important for all the software engineers, so they can always relate to that, and especially the version, the way you concluded at 6.2. And I see more commendation coming in the chat box. There are so many, so probably I may not be able to take all of them. But thanks, Andrew, for sparing time and sharing your insight with us. Thank you very much. Thanks to the VectoScalar Tech Talk show.
Dhanyavad, shukriya.
अरे वाह आपको ये भी आता है थैंक यू that's great. Okay, nice to have you here. So guys, it was an interesting conversation with Andrew Bryant, where he shared how future ready leadership is required to play, especially in the context of tech companies. And as you know, VectoScalar Technology is a technology pioneers serving large enterprises to startups and enabling digital transformation through custom software development, software, web, and mobile app development. Established in 2012, the company today has 100 plus enterprise-grade software engineers and architects. We serve customers across the globe, and here are some of the renowned brands in the industry like Google, SimSim, Kickdrum, CoinSwitch, Dailyhunt, Ford, and many more. In case you have some suggestions for any future VectoScalar Tech Talk session, you want to recommend a speaker, there is a form in the description of this Tech Talk below. Fill in that form, make the suggestion, and help us improve every session with new thought leaders and sharing new insight. Thanks again for watching the show. See ya. Bye bye. Your host, Vikas Chair.